A humble girl, forced to wash the floors of the wealthy, was publicly mocked by a cruel, arrogant millionaire for the crime of poverty. The old woman she loved was insulted, and a sadistic challenge was issued in a lobby dripping with cold, expensive silence. But when a secret from the past was unlocked, the laughter froze on their faces, a shocking truth emerged, and an empire built on greed began to tremble. The war for a legacy had begun. The city was an ocean of luxury, and Lara was drowning in it. Every morning, the pale light of dawn would creep through the single grimy window of their tiny apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten ghosts. It was a world of cracked plaster and the persistent smell of damp, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers of steel and glass that pierced the sky just a few blocks away. Those towers were like monuments to a life she could only dream of, a life without the constant, gnawing anxiety that chewed at the edges of her peace. Elara was young, but her eyes held the ancient weariness of someone who had fought too many battles. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from harsh cleaning chemicals, her knuckles often raw and red. She worked 3 jobs, a frantic, exhausting cycle of mopping floors in silent office buildings after midnight, scrubbing dishes in the greasy heat of a restaurant kitchen, and delivering groceries on a rickety bicycle that threatened to collapse with every turn of the pedals. Every coin she earned was a precious soldier in the war against poverty, deployed with careful strategy. A coin for the rent on their cramped room, a coin for a loaf of bread that was already a day old, and most importantly, a collection of coins for the small, precious bottles of medicine that kept her grandmother Clara breathing. Clara was the center of Elara's universe. She was a fragile bird of a woman, her skin as thin and delicate as parchment, her hair a wispy crown of silver. She spent most of her days in a worn armchair by the window, her world shrinking with each passing year. But her spirit, though quiet, was a resilient flame. It was in her soft smiles, in the way her hand would find Elara's, her touch a silent reassurance that they were not alone. They had each other. This morning, the air in the room felt heavier than usual. The damp had seeped deeper into the walls, and the coffee, brewed from the last dregs in the tin, was weak and bitter. Elara sat at their small, wobbly table, counting out a small pile of coins. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a familiar line of worry etched between her eyes. They were short for the rent, and dangerously short for the next refill of Clara's heart medication. The reality was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. "Is everything all right, my dear?" Clara's voice was a soft, reedy whisper from across the room. Elara forced a smile, a bright, brittle thing that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Everything's fine, Grandma. Just planning our budget. I think we can afford that special tea you like this week." It was a lie, a small, kind deception to shield Clara from the harsh truth of their circumstances. Clara watched her for a long moment, her gaze knowing and full of a profound sadness. She had seen that same look of forced cheerfulness on her own daughter's face, Elara's mother, before sickness had taken her years ago. The cycle of struggle was a cruel inheritance. With a soft sigh, Clara gestured toward a small, dust-covered wooden box on her bedside table. It was a simple thing, carved from dark, aged wood, its surface smooth from decades of handling. "Elara, come here." Elara pushed the coins aside and knelt by her grandmother's chair. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the box, her fingers fumbling with the small brass latch. "There is something I must give you," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "I have held on to it for too long, waiting for the right moment. I fear the right moment may never come, only necessary ones." She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay two items. One was a single, old-fashioned key, its metal tarnished with age, its design ornate and unfamiliar. The other was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth and its pages yellowed. "Your grandfather Arthur left this for you," Clara whispered, her eyes glistening. She rarely spoke of him. He was a ghost in their family history, a man who had disappeared from their lives under a cloud of mystery and sorrow long before Ilara was born. He was a good man, Ilara, a brilliant man. The world did not understand him. Ilara took the journal and the key, their weight feeling strangely significant in her hands. The leather of the journal was soft, like old skin. The key was cold and solid, a piece of a forgotten lock. "He told me to give this to you when you needed it most," Clara continued, her voice barely audible, "when the walls felt like they were closing in. He said this would show you the way, that he built a world for you, a better one, hidden away from the cruelty of this one." A world for her? The idea was so fantastical, so far removed from her reality of counting pennies for medicine, that Ilara could barely process it. Her grandfather had been a builder, a carpenter, she thought. What kind of world could he have possibly built? That night, long after Clara had fallen into a restless sleep, Ilara sat under the weak glow of a single bulb and opened the journal. The first pages were filled with architectural drawings, complex equations, and philosophical musings on the nature of space and light. It was the work of a mind both brilliant and deeply compassionate. He wrote of creating spaces that could heal, buildings that could breathe, cities that served humanity instead of commerce. Her grandfather was not just a carpenter, he was an artist, a visionary. She turned to the last entry, dated just a week before his death. The handwriting was shakier, but the words were clear and direct. "My dearest Ilara," it began, and her heart clenched. He had written her name. "If you are reading this, then the world has been as unkind to you as I feared it would be. Forgive me for not being there to protect you. I had to build a fortress, not of stone, but of silence and distance, to keep what I made safe for you. The enclosed key is not for a treasure chest, but for a beginning. Go to the Blackwood Tower. In the grand lobby, you will find the Sterling International Bank. Ask for Safety Deposit Box 777. It is registered under the name Vance. What you find there is not an ending to your struggles, but a weapon to fight them. Use it wisely. Use it kindly. Your legacy is not the wealth I have left, but the good you will do with it. I love you, Arthur. Blackwood Tower. The name was a symbol of everything that oppressed her. It was the tallest, most arrogant building in the city, a gleaming spear of black glass and steel that seemed to suck the very light from the sky. It was the headquarters of Seraphina Blackwood, the ruthless real estate magnate whose name was synonymous with corporate greed. Her developments had displaced thousands, including families Ilara knew, raising communities to build luxury condos for the ultra-rich. The thought of entering that place made Ilara's stomach churn. It was a lion's den, an alien territory where she would be seen as nothing more than dirt on an expensive shoe. She was a cleaner, A servant? What business could she possibly have in a place like Blackwood Tower? But then she looked over at her grandmother, sleeping fitfully, her breath a shallow, worrying sound. The coins on the table gleamed mockingly in the dim light. They were not enough. They would never be enough. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, a weapon to fight them. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to smolder in her chest. It was not quite hope, but something harder, sharper. It was resolve. The next morning, she helped Clara dress in her finest clothes, a simple, clean dress that had been saved for special occasions that never came. "We're going on an adventure, Grandma," Elara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Clara looked at her, then at the key clutched in Elara's hand. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "It's time, then," she said softly. Together, the young woman in her worn but neat coat and the old woman leaning heavily on her arm took the bus downtown. They were two small, insignificant figures moving toward the heart of power, toward a tower that represented an ocean of luxury they had never been invited to swim in. The journey felt surreal, each block bringing them closer to a world that was designed to intimidate and exclude them. The bus itself seemed to shrink as they drew nearer to the financial district, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the buildings. When they finally stood before it, Blackwood Tower was even more imposing than Elara had imagined. It blotted out the sun, its dark, reflective surface showing them only a distorted, insignificant version of themselves. The entrance was a vast, cavernous maw of polished marble and gold trim, attended by guards in crisp uniforms whose expressions were as hard and unforgiving as the granite floors. Taking a deep breath, Elara tightened her grip on her grandmother's arm. "Ready?" Clara nodded, her frail body trembling slightly, but her eyes were fixed on the entrance with a quiet determination. They stepped through the revolving doors, and the world changed. The noisy, grimy sounds of the city street were instantly replaced by an expensive, hushed silence. The air was cool and smelled faintly of leather and some clean, unidentifiable fragrance. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, vast and echoing, with a ceiling so high it seemed to be a part of the sky itself. People in tailored suits and designer dresses moved with a sleek, predatory grace, their voices low and confident. They were a different species. Elara and Clara, in their simple, threadbare clothes, were like two sparrows that had accidentally flown into a hawk's nest. They were instantly painfully out of place. Every head that turned their way held a look of faint surprise, quickly followed by disdain. They were a stain on the pristine white canvas of this world. Elara could feel the weight of their judgment, a physical pressure that made her want to shrink, to become invisible. On the far side of the lobby, gleaming under a row of spotlights, was the entrance to the Sterling International Bank. It was their destination, but just as they began to walk towards it, a commotion erupted near the main entrance. A woman swept into the lobby as if propelled by her own sense of importance. She was tall and sharp-edged, dressed in a blood-red suit that seemed to cut through the muted colors of the room. Her hair was a severe black bob, her face a mask of calculated beauty and undisguised arrogance. A pack of fawning assistants scurried behind her, carrying briefcases and tablets, their faces a mixture of fear and adoration. It was Seraphina Blackwood. "I want those quarterly reports on my desk in 5 minutes, not 6. She snapped at one of her followers, her voice like cracking ice. And get maintenance up to the penthouse. I think I saw a fingerprint on one of the windows. I will not tolerate filth. She moved through the lobby like a shark parting a school of fish. People stepped out of her way, their heads bowed slightly in deference. She was the queen of this domain, and her power was absolute, her cruelty a casual sport. Elara tried to steer her grandmother around the periphery, hoping to go unnoticed. But Clara, her eyes wide with a kind of innocent wonder, had stopped. Her attention was captured by a magnificent display in the center of the lobby. It was a huge, intricate architectural model under a glass case, depicting a futuristic city of elegant, curving towers and lush green spaces. Unaware of the approaching danger, Clara shuffled closer to the display, her hand gently touching the cool surface of the glass. "Oh, Arthur would have loved this," she breathed, a nostalgic smile on her face. "It looks like one of his dreams." The words, spoken so softly, seemed to echo in the vast, silent space. They reached Seraphina Blackwood, who stopped dead in her tracks. Her cold, predatory gaze swiveled and locked onto the small, frail old woman in the faded dress. A slow, cruel smile spread across Seraphina's face. She glided over to the display case, her entourage freezing in anticipation of the spectacle. "And what would a creature like you know about dreams?" Seraphina purred, her voice dripping with condescension. She looked Clara up and down, her eyes lingering on the worn fabric of her dress and her scuffed, sensible shoes. The disgust on her face was theatrical and profound. Clara, startled, pulled her hand back from the glass as if it were hot. She looked up at the towering, beautiful woman, confused and intimidated. "This," Seraphina said, gesturing to the model with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand, "is a $5 billion vision of the future. It requires intellect, capital, and taste, qualities you are clearly lacking." A ripple of sycophantic laughter spread through her followers and the onlookers in the lobby. It was a nasty, mocking sound that bounced off the cold marble walls. "Can you even spell architecture, grandmother?" Seraphina continued, leaning in closer, enjoying the fear in Clara's eyes. "Move along. The smell of poverty is staining the glass. You can't afford to even breathe the air in here." The insult was a physical blow. It struck Clara with more force than a hand ever could. The light in her eyes dimmed, her shoulders slumped, and a flush of deep, painful shame colored her pale cheeks. She looked small, broken. That was when something inside Elara snapped. The years of quiet suffering, of swallowing her pride, of accepting her lot, it all shattered in an instant. A hot, white rage surged through her, burning away all fear. She strode forward and placed herself between her grandmother and the cruel millionaire. "Leave her alone," Elara said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the mocking laughter with the sharpness of a blade. Seraphina's eyes widened in amused surprise. She turned her attention to Elara, looking her over with the same theatrical disgust. "Oh, and you're her keeper, her little guard dog? How quaint." She smirked. "Tell me, what could you possibly want here? Did you come to beg? Perhaps a loan for a crust of bread?" More laughter, louder this time. It felt like a physical assault. Elara's hand tightened around the old key in her pocket. It was the only armor she had. "We have business here," she stated, her voice trembling slightly but laced with a newfound steel. The declaration was so absurd, so out of place, that it delighted Seraphina. She threw her head back and laughed, a loud braying sound that was utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of power mocking weakness. "Business?" she echoed, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. "With what? The lint in your pockets? The dirt under your fingernails?" She turned and pointed dramatically at the architectural model, the centerpiece of her public arrogance. "You see this project? It is the culmination of my family's legacy. Its value is nearly $5 billion. She turned back to Alara, her eyes gleaming with a sadistic idea. She saw an opportunity for the ultimate public humiliation. "I'll make you a deal, little stray." The lobby fell silent again, everyone leaning in, sensing the kill. "If you," she said, her voice ringing with theatrical flourish, "can prove that you possess even 1/1,000,000th of that value, right here, in this bank, right now, I will personally pay for your grandmother's medical care for the rest of her life. I'll put her in the best private suite with the best doctor's money can buy." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The offer was outlandish, a king's ransom for a pauper. Seraphina's cruel smile widened. "But," she added, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss, "when you fail, and you will fail, you will get down on your hands and knees right here in front of everyone, and you will polish my $5,000 shoes with your tongue. You will show everyone the respect your kind owes to your betters." The silence that followed was thick with morbid anticipation. The terms were monstrous, a public debasement of the highest order. It was a bet designed not to be won, but to utterly destroy what little dignity Alara had left. Alara looked at her grandmother, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, shaking her head slightly, begging her not to do it. She looked at the smug, arrogant face of Seraphina Blackwood, a woman who had everything and chose to use her power to crush those who had nothing. She looked at the sea of expectant faces around them, all waiting for her to crumble. The final personal insult, the demand for her to lick the dirt from Seraphina's shoes, was the spark that ignited the bonfire of her rage. All the fear, all the hesitation was burned away. All that remained was a cold, hard certainty. She met Seraphina's gaze, and for the first time there was no fear in her eyes, only fire. "I accept your offer," Alara said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a finality that stunned the silent lobby. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one had expected this. They had expected tears, begging, a hasty retreat. They had not expected defiance. Seraphina herself seemed taken aback for a split second, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before it was replaced by an even wider, more predatory grin. The girl had taken the bait. The humiliation would be even sweeter now. "Excellent!" Seraphina purred. She gestured grandly toward the entrance of the Sterling International Bank. "The stage is yours. Please, proceed with your business." The crowd parted, creating a path for Alara and Clara. It felt like walking a gauntlet. Every eye was on them, filled with a mixture of scorn, pity, and morbid curiosity. The air was thick with the silent expectation of failure. Alara could feel her grandmother trembling beside her, but she held her arm firmly, lending her some of her own new-found strength. She walked with her head held high, her gaze fixed on the polished brass doors of the bank. She ignored the whispers, the sneers, the palpable condescension that radiated from Seraphina and her circle. In that moment, she was not a cleaner or a pauper. She was Arthur Vance's granddaughter. They reached the bank's reception desk, a formidable barrier of dark mahogany. The man behind it, the bank manager, wore a suit that probably cost more than Alara earned in a year. His name tag read, Mr. Sterling. He looked up, his expression one of polite but firm dismissal. He had clearly witnessed the entire spectacle. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he very much doubted it. Alara did not flinch. She placed the old tarnished key on the polished surface of the desk. The contrast between the humble object and its opulent surroundings was stark. "I am here to access safety deposit box number 777, she said, her voice even. "The account is under the name Vance." Mr. Sterling stared at the key. He then looked at Alara, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Skepticism? In his eyes? He had seen all manner of wealthy and eccentric clients, but this was a new low. A girl who looked like she'd just come from scrubbing floors, accompanied by a frail old woman, presenting a key that looked like it belonged to a pirate's chest. "That is a very old account," he said stiffly, clearly wanting to dismiss them. "We would need to verify—" "Please, just check," Alara interrupted, her patience wearing thin. With a put-upon sigh, Mr. Sterling turned to his computer. He typed in the information, his fingers moving with disdainful slowness. He was likely expecting the system to return an error, to tell him no such account existed. He was expecting to be able to send these vagrants on their way. But the system did not return an error. A screen popped up, and Mr. Sterling's bored expression froze. His eyes widened slightly. He leaned closer to the monitor, reading the information that had appeared. The account was not just old, it was dormant, and it was marked with several high-level security flags he had never seen before. He looked from the screen to Alara, then back again. The condescension in his eyes was replaced by a dawning confusion. He stood up slowly. "Follow me," he said, his voice now stripped of its earlier arrogance, replaced with a note of professional caution. He led them from the main lobby into a hushed, heavily secured area. The air grew colder. They walked down a corridor lined with brushed steel and entered a circular room, the heart of the vault. In the center stood a wall of safety deposit boxes, their brass doors gleaming under the cold, clinical lights. Serafina and a few of her closest followers had trailed them, standing at the edge of the secured zone, unable to enter, but close enough to witness the inevitable failure. Serafina's arms were crossed, a smug, impatient look on her face. She was already imagining the taste of her victory. Mr. Sterling stopped in front of a box marked 777. He used his own master key, then gestured for Alara to use hers. With a trembling hand, she inserted the old tarnished key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. She turned it. There was a solid, satisfying click. The heavy little door swung open. The box was not filled with cash or jewels, as the onlookers might have fantasized. It was almost empty. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a single, starkly modern object, a card made of matte black metal. It had no name, no numbers, just a simple, elegant crest etched into its surface, a stylized V. Beside it lay a single, folded document, bound with a simple ribbon. Alara reached in and took them. The card was heavy, cool to the touch. The document felt momentous. Mr. Sterling stared at the black card. His breath caught in his throat. He recognized the design, not from experience, but from legend. It was spoken of in the highest echelons of the bank, a mythical object. That can't be," he stammered, his professional composure completely unraveling. "That's a founder's card." He snatched a portable scanner from a nearby console, his hand shaking. "May I?" he asked, his voice now filled with a desperate awe. Lara nodded. He scanned the card. The screen on his device lit up. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. His eyes bulged as he stared at the information displayed. He looked from the screen to Alara, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. "What is it?" Serafina called out impatiently from the edge of the room. "Is it empty? Did the little rat find a bus token?" Mr. Sterling didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at Alara with an expression of utter, world-altering shock. "This card," he said, his voice a choked whisper, "it grants direct, unlimited access to the primary holding account of the Vance estate." He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking back to the screen. "The liquid assets. The balance it's over $500 million. A collective sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. 500 million. The number was so vast, so incomprehensible, that it hung in the air like a physical object. It was more than enough to win the bet. But Mr. Sterling wasn't finished. He was now looking at the document Alara held. "But that's not all," he croaked, his voice trembling. "The card is just the key. The estate itself, the primary asset." He looked up, his eyes locking with Serafina's across the room. His next words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a bomb. "According to these deeds, the Vance estate is the majority shareholder of Blackwood Tower, of the entire Blackwood Corporation." He turned his gaze back to Alara, a look of profound, terrified respect on his face. "She owns this building," he said, his voice now loud enough to carry across the lobby. "She owns everything." The laughter that had been simmering in the throats of Serafina's entourage died instantly. It froze in the air, shattering into a million pieces of silent shock. The smug, cruel smile on Serafina Blackwood's face evaporated as if it had been wiped away by an invisible hand. Her face, a moment before flushed with arrogant triumph, became a ghastly pale mask of disbelief. Absolute, deafening silence descended upon the grand lobby. The world seemed to stop spinning. The quiet hum of the air conditioning, the distant traffic, the very heartbeats of the people present, it all vanished. All that remained was the echo of Mr. Sterling's words. "She owns everything." The crowd of onlookers, who had been jeering and mocking just moments before, now stood like statues, their faces a comical tableau of dropped jaws and wide, unblinking eyes. The scorn in their expressions had been replaced by a raw, unfiltered awe. Some looked at Alara as if she had just performed a miracle. Others looked at Serafina, watching the queen of their world crumble before their very eyes. Clara, who had been leaning heavily on a nearby counter, let out a soft, trembling gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears, not of shame this time, but of overwhelming, stunning vindication. She looked at her granddaughter, who stood in the center of the vault room, holding the black card and the deed, and saw not the tired girl who counted coins, but a figure of immense unforeseen power. Alara herself felt strangely calm, as if she were in the eye of a hurricane. The noise, the shock, the shifting power dynamics, it all felt distant. Her world had just been turned upside down, but in her heart there was only a quiet, resolute clarity. She looked at the card in her hand, the key to a life she could never have imagined. Her grandfather's words came back to her, a weapon to fight them, But the most dramatic transformation was Serafina. She was paralyzed, frozen in a state of pure, undiluted shock. Her mind, usually so quick and calculating, simply refused to process the information. It was impossible. A lie. A trick. This waif, this piece of street trash, could not possibly own her empire. Her father had built it. It was hers by right, by blood. "That's impossible!" she finally shrieked, the sound tearing through the silent lobby. Her voice was shrill, ugly, stripped of all its cultivated polish. "It's a lie! You're a fraud!" She lunged forward, trying to get past the security barrier, her eyes wild with fury. "Sterling, you're fired! You're all fired! This is a conspiracy!" But no one was looking at her. All eyes were on Mr. Sterling, who, despite his own shock, was a man of rules and numbers. He held up the scanner for Serafina to see, his hand steady now. The biometric marker on the card is linked to the Vance family line, authenticated by a sealed protocol from our founding chairman. The deed is notarized and ironclad. "It's all here, Madam Blackwood. The Vance estate was the silent primary investor that funded your father's initial venture. He was given a management role and a minority stake. Controlling interest was always retained by the estate, held in this vault, waiting for the designated heir to claim it. The explanation was a series of hammer blows, each one demolishing another pillar of Serafina's world. Her father wasn't a titan of industry, he was a manager. Her inheritance wasn't an empire, it was a minority stake. Her entire life, her identity, was built on a lie. Elara stepped out of the vault room, the black card held loosely in her hand. She walked past the stunned onlookers, her gaze fixed on Serafina. She stopped a few feet from her, the woman who had wanted her to lick her shoes. "You made a bet," Elara said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of her newfound authority. "You promised to pay for my grandmother's medical care for the rest of her life." Serafina stared at her, her face contorted in a mask of hatred and disbelief. She was cornered, humiliated, and she lashed out with the only weapon she had left, venom. "You think you won," she hissed. "You think this is over? I will bury you in lawyers. I will tear you apart in the press. You're nothing but a gutter rat who stumbled into a crown. You have no idea how to rule." Just then, an elderly man in a simple but well-tailored suit stepped forward from the crowd. He had been watching from the sidelines, his expression calm and observant. He walked to Elara's side and gave a slight, respectful bow. "Mr. Arthur Vance always said that true rule requires not a crown, but a conscience," the man said, his voice gentle but firm. "Something the Blackwood family has been sorely lacking." He turned to Elara. "My name is Mr. Hemlock. I was your grandfather's lawyer and the executor of his will. I have been waiting for this day for a very long time, Miss Vance." The arrival of Mr. Hemlock, the keeper of the secret, was the final confirmation. He was the living link to the past, the proof that this was not a mistake. He carried a worn leather briefcase. He turned his attention to the architectural model in the center of the lobby, the source of the initial confrontation. He looked at it with a sad, knowing expression. "A beautiful design," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Your grandfather would be proud to see it built." He paused, then looked directly at Serafina. Though he would be horrified to know his philanthropic vision for a self-sustaining community for the underprivileged was stolen and rebranded as a for-profit luxury venture. Another bomb had dropped. The project Serafina had claimed as her family's legacy was stolen. It belonged to Arthur Vance. The very symbol of her arrogance was a fraud. Mr. Hemlock opened his briefcase and pulled out a rolled-up set of blueprints, their paper yellowed with age. He unrolled them on a nearby table. They were the original hand-drawn plans for the city, signed and dated by Arthur Vance. They were identical to the model, but they included annotations and notes detailing his true vision. Schools, hospitals, affordable housing, all powered by clean energy. Your grandfather's magnum opus, Mr. Hemlock explained to Alara. He poured his heart into it. After his death, the plans vanished from my office. I always suspected where they went. The crowd murmured, the story becoming clearer, the lines between victim and villain drawn in stark, undeniable ink. Serafina Blackwood was not just arrogant, she was a thief. As Serafina sputtered, trying to form a response, a small, nervous-looking man pushed his way through the crowd. He was clutching a faded file folder. I have to say something," he stammered. He looked at Mr. Hemlock. "My name is Peterson. I own a small bookstore downtown. 20 years ago, Serafina's father tried to run me out of business with a predatory loan. He wanted the land for a parking garage." He opened the folder, his hands shaking. "A man, an anonymous benefactor, bought the debt and restructured it with terms I could afford. He saved my family's business. He only asked that I keep these documents safe." He pulled out a letter. It was signed with the distinctive V crest. It was from Arthur Vance. He was the first soldier in the Silent Army. Before the shock of this could settle, an older woman stepped forward, her face lined with emotion. "He saved our home, too," she said, her voice thick with tears. This bank, was foreclosing on us. A letter arrived, a single letter saying the mortgage was paid in full. We never knew who it was until now." One by one, they emerged from the crowd. A quiet collection of people, invisible in this world of wealth, who had been touched by Arthur Vance's hidden kindness, a scholarship that sent a poor boy to university, a donation that kept a community art center from closing. Each story was a testament to a legacy of compassion, a secret army of gratitude that had been waiting in the wings for decades. Each testimony was a nail in Serafina's coffin. Her family's reputation, which she had wielded like a weapon, was being dismantled piece by piece, revealed as a facade built on theft and cruelty, standing in stark contrast to the quiet, profound goodness of the man they had wronged. Serafina, finally recovering from her paralysis, realized she was losing control completely. The narrative was slipping from her grasp. She pulled out her phone, her fingers jabbing at the screen with frantic energy. "You'll all regret this," she snarled, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "I still have influence. I have lawyers who will eat you alive. I will call the press and paint her as a manipulative gold digger. By the time I'm done, this entire city will believe you are all part of a grand conspiracy to defraud me." She began barking orders into her phone, her voice regaining some of its imperious tone. "Get me Marcus. Get me the board. Freeze all access to my accounts. Issue a press release. I want a restraining order against this girl. Now." She was trying to build a wall of money and power around herself, to use the same underhanded tactics that had always worked for her. She tried to bribe Mr. Sterling on the spot, offering him a promotion, a fortune, to declare the documents forgeries. He simply shook his head, his face a mask of disgust. She threatened to ruin him, to have him blacklisted from every financial institution in the country. My only duty is to the rightful owner of this bank's assets, Sterling replied coldly, and that is Miss Vance. The battle lines were drawn. Serafina was cornered, but she was not yet defeated. She was a wounded animal, and that made her more dangerous than ever. She retreated from the lobby, surrounded by her few remaining loyalists, a whirlwind of fury and threats, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Elara stood amidst her newfound allies, the weight of the Blackwood Empire now resting on her young shoulders. The fight was far from over. It had just begun. The initial shock had given way to a terrifying reality. Serafina would not give up her kingdom without a war. Mr. Hemlock placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your grandfather knew this day would come," he said softly. "He knew the Blackwoods would not go quietly, but he prepared for it. The journal, the allies, the paper trail, it's all part of his plan. He didn't just leave you a fortune, Elara. He left you a strategy." Elara looked at the faces around her, the grateful bookseller, the tearful homeowner, the loyal lawyer. She looked at her grandmother, whose face was now alight with a fierce protective pride. This was her army, an army built not on power or wealth, but on decades of quiet, unassuming kindness. The war had begun, and for the first time in her life, Elara was not the one who was outnumbered. The days that followed were a blur of coordinated chaos. Serafina Blackwood, true to her word, unleashed a storm of legal and media attacks. The city's most ruthless law firm, on retainer for the Blackwood Corporation for decades, filed a barrage of motions accusing Elara of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. They sought an emergency injunction to freeze the Vance estate and bar Elara from exercising any control. Simultaneously, a sophisticated public relations campaign went into overdrive. Tabloid headlines screamed stories of a cunning young woman who had manipulated a senile old lady into helping her execute a fantastical heist. They painted Elara as a villain from a fairy tale, a gold digger of unprecedented ambition. They published photos of her small, shabby apartment, contrasting them with images of Blackwood Tower, framing the conflict as an absurd assault on a respected family's legacy. But Serafina had made a critical error. She assumed the world operated on her terms, that money and influence were the only currencies that mattered. She underestimated the power of a good story. And Elara's story, guided by the quiet wisdom of Mr. Hemlock, was far more powerful than any lie Serafina could spin. Mr. Hemlock convened a meeting in a modest but dignified office he had maintained for years, just waiting for this day. It was a war room. Elara, Clara, Mr. Peterson, the bookseller, the homeowner, Mrs. Gable, and a grizzled old architect named Ben Carter, who had been Arthur Vance's protege, gathered around a large oak table. "Serafina's strategy is to create chaos and doubt," Mr. Hemlock explained, his voice calm and steady amidst the storm. "She wants to drown us in legal paperwork and poison public opinion before we can even stand up. Our strategy must be the opposite. We will be methodical, we will be truthful, we will let the facts speak for themselves." He laid out Arthur's plan, a masterpiece of long-term strategic thinking. Every act of kindness Arthur had performed had been meticulously, if discreetly, documented. Every predatory move by the Blackwood family had been noted and filed away. Arthur had known that his legacy would one day be a battlefield, and he had spent years forging the weapons his heir would need. The first order of business was the emergency board meeting of the Blackwood Corporation, which Serafina herself had called, in a fit of rage, confident she could command the loyalty of the board members she had handpicked and enriched over the years. It was to be the site of the final showdown. The meeting was scheduled for Friday in the main boardroom on the top floor of Blackwood Tower, the very heart of Serafina's power. The atmosphere in the city was electric. The media had descended, camping outside the tower. The story had transcended the business pages. It was a modern-day fable of David and Goliath, of the pauper and the princess. On the morning of the meeting, Alara stood before a mirror in the simple hotel suite Mr. Hemlock had secured for them. He had brought her a simple, elegant, dark blue dress. It was the first new piece of clothing she had owned in years. It felt like a costume, the uniform of a person she did not yet know how to be. "You look like him," Clara said softly from behind her. "You have his eyes, that same fire." She placed her hands on Alara's shoulders, her touch firm and steady. "Do not be afraid of them, my dear. They are the ones who are small." Alara took a deep breath, her grandfather's journal held tightly in her hands. She was ready. They arrived at Blackwood Tower not as interlopers, but as contenders. The guards who had sneered at them days before now looked at them with a mixture of fear and respect, holding the doors open with a newfound urgency. The boardroom was a temple of corporate power. A long, gleaming obsidian table stretched across a room with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike view of the city below. Serafina sat at the head of the table, flanked by a team of stone-faced lawyers. She looked impeccable, her composure restored, her face a mask of cold, confident fury. The other board members, a collection of wealthy, powerful men and women, were arranged along the table, their expressions unreadable. They were sharks, waiting to see which predator would bleed first. "Let us dispense with the theatrics," Serafina began, her voice like ice. "We are here to address a baseless and fraudulent claim against this corporation and my family's legacy. My lawyers have prepared a comprehensive presentation that will expose this charade for what it is." She gestured to her lead attorney, a man with a cruel, thin smile. He stood and began to present what he clearly believed was their unbeatable final move. He projected a complex series of documents onto a large screen. "As you can see," the lawyer droned, "the initial investment made by the Vance entity in 1985 was legally converted into a long-term, structured corporate bond in 1998 by my client's father, the late Mr. Blackwood. This bond was subsequently acquired and restructured by a subsidiary holding company controlled by the Blackwood family. The ownership stake was legally dissolved. The Vance estate is owed nothing but the final principal of the bond, a sum of approximately $50 million, which my client is prepared to generously offer as a settlement to end this frivolous lawsuit." It was a brilliant, labyrinthine trap, a paper trail a mile long, filled with legal jargon and complex financial instruments, all designed to prove that Arthur Vance's ownership had been legally stripped away years ago. It appeared airtight. A few of the board members nodded, looking convinced. Serafina allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She had them. The lawyer concluded his presentation. "In short, Miss Vance has no claim to this company. She has no power here." The room was silent. All eyes turned to Alara. This was her moment, the moment to fold, to accept the settlement, to run away with a fortune she had never dreamed of. But Alara did not look at the money. She looked at Seraphina's smug face. She thought of her grandmother's shame in the lobby. She thought of the bookseller and the homeowner and all the others her grandfather had helped. She stood up, placing her grandfather's worn journal on the obsidian table. The simple, humble object looked almost sacred in the sterile, opulent room. "My grandfather was not a financier," Alara said, her voice quiet but clear, resonating with an unshakable moral authority. "He was a builder, and he knew that some things cannot be bought or sold, things like trust and integrity." She did not try to argue the legal points. She did not need to. She simply opened the journal to a specific page. "Mr. Hemlock," she said calmly. The old lawyer stood. He did not present documents. He presented people. "I would like to call our first witness," he said, pressing a button on a small remote. The boardroom doors opened. Ben Carter, the old architect, walked in. He carried a set of original hand-annotated blueprints. He laid them out on the table next to the journal. "These are Arthur Vance's final plans for the City of Light project," Carter said, his voice rough with emotion. "I worked alongside him. I saw him draw every line, and I also saw Seraphina's father visit him, feigning interest, just weeks before Arthur's death. After he died, the official plans vanished. These are Arthur's personal copies, which he entrusted to me." He pointed a trembling finger at Seraphina. "Her project is a stolen dream." The board members shifted uncomfortably. This was not about bonds and subsidiaries anymore. This was about theft. "Next," Mr. Hemlock said. Mr. Peterson, the bookseller, entered. He presented the letters from Arthur Vance, and more importantly, the original predatory loan documents from Blackwood's father, showing a clear pattern of unethical business practices. Then came the final devastating blow. "Our final witness," Mr. Hemlock announced, "is Mr. Sterling, the branch manager of Sterling International Bank." Mr. Sterling walked in, looking nervous but resolute. He held a slim USB drive. "As an officer of the bank, I am bound by fiduciary duty to report illegal activity. When Miss Vance's account was activated, it triggered a full internal audit, as per the Vance protocol established by your grandfather." He directed this last part to Alara. "The audit uncovered a significant discrepancy," Sterling continued, his voice gaining confidence. "The subsidiary holding company that supposedly acquired the Vance bond was a shell corporation, registered offshore. More importantly, it was funded not by Blackwood assets, but by illegally transferring funds from a protected trust." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "That trust," he said, looking directly at Seraphina, "was the Vance Family Education Trust, established by Arthur Vance himself and administered by the Blackwood family. It was intended to provide university scholarships. Seraphina Blackwood has been embezzling funds from it for over a decade to finance her lavish lifestyle and her corporate acquisitions." He inserted the USB drive into the boardroom's computer. The screen, which had moments before shown Seraphina's fabricated legal defense, now displayed bank statements, transaction records, a clear, undeniable trail of theft and fraud leading directly to Seraphina. The boardroom erupted. The carefully constructed facade of Blackwood power had not just been cracked, it had been dynamited. The document her lawyer had presented was not just a lie, it was evidence of a massive, long-running criminal enterprise. The board members, who had been on Seraphina's side moments before, now looked at her with open horror and disgust. They were sharks, and they could smell blood in the water, her blood. They were businessmen, and they knew they had to distance themselves from this sinking ship immediately. "This is outrageous, a fabrication!" Serafina screamed, rising from her chair, her face pale and sweaty. But her lawyers were already quietly packing their briefcases, their faces grim. They knew a lost cause when they saw one. The game was over. One of the oldest board members, a man named Richards, stood up. His face was like stone. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in CEO Serafina Blackwood, and I move to turn over all evidence presented here today to the district attorney's office." "Seconded," another voice called out instantly. "All in favor?" A forest of hands went up. It was unanimous. Serafina stared at the raised hands, the unanimous verdict of her peers, the people she had controlled and commanded. It was the end of her world. She sank back into her chair, a strange, broken sound escaping her lips. "Security?" Richard said grimly into the intercom. Two large security guards entered the room. They walked to Serafina's chair. She looked up at them, her eyes vacant, her arrogance finally, utterly shattered. She was no longer the queen. She was just a criminal. As they escorted her from the room, she passed Ilara. For a moment, their eyes met. In Serafina's, there was no remorse, no understanding, only a hollow, burning hatred. She had lost everything, and she still didn't understand why. Ilara watched her go, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound sadness. She had won. The battle was over, but the victory felt heavy. As the boardroom doors closed behind the defeated magnate, the sound of camera flashes and shouting reporters could be heard from the hallway. Serafina Blackwood, who had lived her life in the spotlight of adoration and power, was now walking into the blinding glare of public disgrace. She was alone, defeated, and utterly humiliated, her empire crumbling into dust around her. The harvest of her cruelty had finally come. The silence that fell over the boardroom after Serafina's departure was thick with the ghosts of broken power. The board members, once her allies, were now scrambling to save themselves, their voices a low murmur of damage control and frantic calls to their own lawyers. Ilara stood by the window, looking down at the city spread out below her. It looked different from up here, not like an enemy, but like a responsibility. Mr. Hemlock came to stand beside her. "Your grandfather would be so proud, Ilara," he said gently. Ilara didn't answer immediately. She felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, as if she had been holding her breath for her entire life and had only just now been able to release it. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a tear of relief, of grief for the life she had lost, and of fear for the one that was just beginning. She had fought the dragon and won. Now she was the master of its hoard, a treasure so vast it terrified her. Her first phone call was not to a broker or a banker. It was to the finest private hospital in the country, a place she had only ever read about in magazines. She spoke to the head of cardiology, her voice clear and firm, making arrangements for her grandmother's immediate transfer and care. There was no hesitation, no question of cost. For the first time, the answer to the question of "Can we afford it?" was a simple, resounding yes. Later that day, in the quiet of their hotel suite, she sat with Clara. The news of Serafina's arrest was all over the television, her perp walk a repeating loop of public shame. Ilara turned it off. She took her grandmother's frail hands in her own. "It's over, Grandma," she whispered. Clara looked at her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't speak of the money, or the tower, or the victory. She simply pulled Elara into a fierce, trembling hug. They held each other for a long time, and Elara finally allowed herself to cry, not just for the victory of the day, but for the years of struggle, for the meals they had missed, for the cold nights, for the shame of being poor in a world that worshipped wealth. It was a cathartic release, a washing away of all the pain they had endured in silence. They were healing. The very next day, Elara held her first press conference. She didn't hold it in the opulent boardroom, but in the lobby of Blackwood Tower, in the very spot where her grandmother had been humiliated. She stood before the architectural model of her grandfather's city, the cameras flashing, the reporters shouting questions. She looked small and unassuming in her simple blue dress, but when she spoke, her voice was filled with a quiet power that commanded attention. "This tower, this company, this wealth, it is not mine," she began, stunning the room into silence. "It is a legacy, and a legacy is not something you own. It is something you owe. It is a debt to the past and a promise to the future." She announced her first official act as the head of the newly reformed Vance Corporation. The company would be restructured from the ground up, with a new charter focused on ethical practices and employee welfare. All the predatory loans issued by the Blackwood regime would be forgiven. The wages for the lowest paid employees, the cleaners, the security guards, the maintenance staff, would be more than doubled, effective immediately. Then she turned to the model of the city. "My grandfather, Arthur Vance, designed this project not for profit, but for people," she declared. "He called it Ethelgard, the noble protector. It was meant to be a place of dignity, beauty, and opportunity for those who have been denied all three. Therefore, the Ethelgard project will go forward exactly as he intended. The entire $5 billion valuation of the project will be placed into a non-profit foundation. It will be built not as a monument to corporate vanity, but as a home for the homeless, for struggling families, for the elderly, a place where the quality of your life is not determined by the size of your bank account." She paused, her gaze finding her grandmother, who stood at the edge of the crowd supported by Mr. Hemlock, her face beaming with pride. "I would like to dedicate this project to the woman who taught me everything I know about strength, dignity, and love," Elara said, her voice thick with emotion. "It will be named the Clara Vance Community of Ethelgard." The announcement sent a shock wave through the city and then the world. It was an act of such radical benevolence, such a profound rejection of the corporate greed that Serafina had embodied, that it captured the global imagination. Elara Vance was not just another rich heir. She was something new. Later that week, Mr. Hemlock presented Elara with one final item from the vault. It was a sealed envelope addressed to her in Arthur's familiar script. "My dearest Elara," the letter inside read, "if you are reading this, it means our plan succeeded. It means you have reclaimed what is ours, and you have faced the dragon. I am sorry I had to leave you this battle to fight. I had hoped the world would be kinder, but I knew I had to prepare for the worst. I built an empire of numbers and steel, but I was always afraid of it. Wealth is a poison, Elara. It can calcify the heart, blind the eyes to suffering, and convince a person that they are a god. I saw what it did to the Blackwood family. I saw how it turned ambition into greed, and confidence into cruelty. That is why I had to hide it from you. I could have given you a life of luxury, but it would have been a cage. It would have robbed you of the very qualities that make you worthy of this legacy: your humility, your compassion, your resilience. I needed you to understand the value of a single coin before I could trust you with billions. I needed you to know the sting of shame before you could wield the power to heal it in others. Your struggle was not a punishment. It was your armor. Do not be burdened by this wealth. It is just a tool, like a hammer or a chisel. Use it to build things that last. Use it to build kindness, to build justice, to build hope. The money will run out eventually, but the good you build in the world will echo for generations. That is your true inheritance. That is the Vance legacy. Be good, be kind, and know that wherever I am prouder of you than words can ever say. Your loving grandfather, Arthur. Elara folded the letter, her heart full. The weight on her shoulders had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer the terrifying burden of wealth, but the profound, hopeful weight of a sacred trust. The moral victory was complete. She was not just the heir to a fortune, she was the heir to a philosophy. 10 years passed. The city skyline had changed. Where a patch of urban decay and forgotten warehouses once stood, there now rose the elegant green-laced spires of the Clara Vance community of Ethelgard. It was not a housing project. It was a work of art. The buildings curved and soared, designed to maximize light and air, interwoven with public parks, rooftop gardens, and flowing waterways. It was a city within a city, powered entirely by renewable energy, and it was beautiful. Inside, there were no luxury condos. There were dignified, spacious apartments for thousands of families who had once been on the verge of homelessness. There was a state-of-the-art public school, a free community health clinic, and a vibrant art center. It was a thriving, breathing testament to Arthur Vance's dream and Elara's promise. Elara Vance was no longer the girl who washed floors. She was one of the most respected philanthropists in the world. But she had not changed. She still wore simple, elegant clothes, lived in a modest apartment, though one without a leaky roof, and preferred a quiet cup of tea with her grandmother to a glamorous gala. Clara, living comfortably into her 90s with the best care imaginable, was her constant companion and moral compass. The Vance Corporation, under Elara's leadership, had become a global model for ethical capitalism. It invested in sustainable technology, fair trade businesses, and medical research, proving that profit and principle could coexist. The Vance Foundation, funded by the corporation's profits, had awarded thousands of scholarships, saved countless small businesses, and funded community projects all over the world. Elara was not just spending her grandfather's money. She was growing his legacy, planting seeds of kindness that blossomed in the most unexpected places. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elara was visiting a small local library in a working-class neighborhood, a library the Vance Foundation had recently saved from closure. She walked through the quiet aisles, smiling at the children reading in cozy nooks, her heart filled with a quiet satisfaction. Then she saw a familiar scene. A young girl, no older than 10, stood at the checkout counter with her grandmother, a tired-looking woman with worry etched deep into her face. The girl was clutching a thick book on astronomy, her eyes shining with excitement. But the librarian was shaking her head apologetically. "I'm sorry," the librarian said gently. "You have a late fee on your account. It's only $5, but I can't let you check out another book until it's paid." The girl's face fell, her excitement instantly extinguished. The grandmother sighed, her shoulders slumping as she began to dig through a worn coin purse, her fingers fumbling to count out a small collection of change. It was a mirror image of Elara's own past, a painful echo of a life she had almost forgotten. Elara quietly walked over to the counter. She placed a crisp $10 bill on the polished wood. "I'll take care of it," she said softly. "And please use the rest to clear the late fees for the next person who can't afford it." The grandmother and the young girl turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and gratitude. The girl's eyes were wide, staring at this kind, well-dressed stranger. Elara knelt down to be at the girl's eye level. "What book do you have there?" she asked with a genuine smile. "It's about stars," the girl whispered, holding the book up. "I want to be an astronomer." "That's a wonderful dream," Elara said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a simple card. It was not a black credit card, but a plain white card with the Vance Foundation's crest. On the back was a phone number and the words, "Future Leaders Scholarship Program." She handed it to the girl. "Someone once believed in my dream when I had nothing," Elara said, her voice gentle. "They gave me a chance. Now, it's my turn to pay it forward. When you're ready for university, you call that number. We'll be waiting for you." The grandmother stared at her, then at the card, recognition dawning in her tear-filled eyes. You're her," she whispered in awe. "You're Elara Vance." Elara simply smiled, gave the young girl's shoulder a final encouraging squeeze, and walked away, leaving them in a state of stunned, hopeful silence. As for Seraphina Blackwood, her fate was a quiet, pathetic postscript. She served 3 years in a low-security prison for fraud and embezzlement. When she was released, she was a ghost. Her name was a synonym for disgrace. Her friends had abandoned her, her fortune was gone, confiscated to pay back the trusts she had plundered and the investors she had deceived. She was left with nothing but her own bitter pride. A news article once mentioned her, a brief, passing human interest story. She had been offered a job, an administrative position at a homeless shelter, a shelter, ironically, that received a significant portion of its funding from the Vance Foundation. She had been given a second chance, a path to redemption, a way to build something new from the ashes of her life. But she was too proud to take it. The idea of accepting charity, especially charity that flowed from her vanquisher, was more humiliating to her than prison itself. She refused the offer, choosing to live in obscurity, consumed by her own resentment. She chose bitterness over grace, a final sad testament to a character that was as hollow as her fallen empire. Elara never hated her. She pitied her. Seraphina was a prisoner of her own making, trapped in a cage of arrogance from which she refused to be freed. As Elara left the library that day, the autumn sun cast long shadows on the street. She thought of her grandfather's letter, of the seeds of kindness he had planted so long ago. She had spent the last decade watering them, nurturing them, watching them grow into a forest of hope. The harvest would be eternal.